Singing, oh, reduce the damage done to me.
So, Tim, in the last episode, we talked a lot about our campaign world of Dragongrin, but we didn't cover why it's called Dragongrin, and you brought me here today to sort of talk that out. So, why do you think, what's your idea for why it's called Dragongrin?
Well, the first thing I want to say, and I want to make sure that everybody knows this, it sounded like a cool name at the time.
Yeah.
So for a long, so let me walk you through this too. I thought, Dragongrin, that sounds neat. So I Googled it, and there was nothing that I found on Google, which is sort of like the first test of, did somebody else use this?
Yeah.
So, registered the domain. I was like, oh, I'm going to buy the domain, as most people do, put the cart before the horse, before it's even a thing. I'm like, well, just in case.
The blueprints of the cart before the bill of sale on the horse.
That's the episode quote right there. So, I thought, okay, Dragongrin is a cool name. But I found myself shy telling people. Like, I was embarrassed at the name.
I didn't know that.
Just because I don't know why. Did you always like it?
Yeah, just like Dragongrin. And at the time, we had a few different ideas of why it was, and they kind of changed, or I didn't worry about them, but the whole time I was like, no, it's Dragongrin. It doesn't matter if, to me personally, it doesn't matter if the name never comes up. It's Dragongrin. It's the Tabletop Terrors setting.
Right.
It's like, no, that's what it is. Why is the car, the ride-sharing app called Uber? It sounds cool. They got the domain, Maybe they have a reason where it's like, oh, well, we Uber the... Doesn't matter. It's called Uber, and everybody knows it, and it's like, no, it's Dragongrin.
I love it. And so...
Also, just so happens that one of the places in our campaign world is called Grin. That may have been before it was called Dragongrin or after, but you can tie that together.
Well, we can't, and that's... I plan on it. I plan on it now, but... So, we're coming up with this stuff, we're putting things in there, and we're putting things in the campaign world, and I kept thinking... yeah, it's called Dragongrin. Like, I don't know why. I just felt so self-conscious about it. And then I thought, okay, we were working at the time with two really good friends of ours who are now our business partners. Barker from Be a Better Game Master on YouTube and Matt Click from A Fistful of Dice on YouTube. And both of them had these very formal, like, land sounding names, like, this is a land that exists. Like, yeah. That's it. That's all I think about. I imagine a guy doing a voiceover explaining how this is a land of mystery. And I'm like, I don't imagine a guy saying that about Dragongrin.
Yeah.
This is a land of nicknamery.
Well, and
like, that's what I think of with Dragongrin.
Well, yeah.
Well, just real quick, their names were Matt Click's Aeronoth, which I thought, yeah. Okay, I'm bought in immediately. And Barker's is Ankea. And I was like, oh, and I almost felt pressure.
Yeah.
To come up with something else. So you and I did.
Well, and again, I don't see anything wrong with that. So first, what did we come up with? What is the name of our land?
So the name of our land in the trailer, in the movie, not the prequel. What do they call it? Not the pre-roll. What do they call it in the movie where they do
prologue?
Thanks.
No, I didn't know that was the right word.
No, that was it. In the prologue of the film Dragon Slayer. The point is, we came up with Arthenvale, and people very quickly pointed out, well, do you know Vale means valley? So you're dumb.
Well, I think that your dumb part was a bit implied.
They were like, hey, why is it called Arthenvale? You do know that that's for valleys, right? And this isn't a valley? And
I said, well, etymology is different in our world, so... And this is a visual aid. You can't see me giving them a rude gesture.
He is. Well, but can I also say, though, too, I will come clean and I will say I did not know that Vale meant valley.
Well, and in the same
I had no
respect,
idea. I had no idea. I'm not going to lie. And because in the nature of this podcast, I want people to understand this stuff's going to happen. You're going to have this awesome idea that you think is awesome, and then someone being helpful is going to maybe correct a word you're using wrong or something, and it's going to sort of be... It's a downer.
Well, and here's what I say to that, though, is think about how many people are, called tiny when they're huge. it's like,
yeah, exactly.
not necessarily every single name has everything to do with what it is, because it's Arthenvale, and sometimes Vale might mean valley, but in this case, maybe it doesn't. It's the name of our world.
I gotta tell you, John Allen Large from the Red Dice Diaries swoops into the thread, like, in his Batman uniform. And he's basically like, I'm going to butcher a John Allen Large impersonation. Should I?
He's going to do it.
I?
You're good at it, so you can. But
now I'm not.
I don't know. I don't know if I'd be offended if I were John Allen Large.
So it's like, hello, this is John Allen Large from the Red Dice Diaries. And Vale doesn't always mean valley in certain parts of the world.
Exactly. And that's like totally, I'm on that same train with him.
And by the way, go subscribe to Red Dice Diaries. John Allen Large is a great content creator, and hopefully he will. He's a great guy.
Hopefully he finds that endearing.
As endearing as I meant it. Well, I came up with something, and it's okay to do this. It's okay to go, oh, okay, it means valley. Well, in our worlds, because each one of us, when I said our business partners and our friends, each one of our worlds was going to basically be a continent. I thought, because like what we were talking about before, how we wanted Dragongrin to be like the entropy, sort of like the non-shiny, kind of downtrodden place, I thought.
We want it to be episode 2 of Lord of the Rings. We want it to be the two towers where totally. Everything is just bleak and upsetting the whole time.
Exactly.
There's not a glimmer of hope in that movie. That's Arthenvale.
That's Arthenvale. And I thought to myself, that would be why, is that it's almost like even the makers of the land, like not the makers of the land, but someone somewhere eventually started calling it the Valley of Arthen. Meaning this whole place is so down that we're going to call it essentially the etymology of a valley.
Exactly.
The whole continent.
All of the lands in this area. Yep. They're the valley of the whole planet.
Exactly. And so we were like, okay, we'll retcon it. Arthenvale means the valley of the world.
Exactly.
And there you go. And I'm totally happy with that. I think that that's great, and it paints the picture of what the world is.
Yeah, and I think it's even cooler, and it turns out in this case that the fact that Vale sometimes means valley is a good thing.
Exactly. So, but even then, I felt like we made up Arthenvale, and I'm glad we did. But I feel like I made it up because I was ashamed. Well, what's a word that doesn't sound ashamed? Like, I wasn't like, but I felt self-conscious about Dragongrin. Like, I didn't want people to imagine like a cartoon dragon on the logo. I don't know.
Well, okay, so let me just say this. The first time I heard about the sort of setting of Spelljammer, I thought, the hell's a Spelljammer? I didn't even realize it was D&D. That it was a fantasy setting. I was like, I imagined wizards with AKs. Like, in the full, like, hat and everything. Like, hat, wand in one hand, dude toting an AK. And he's shooting at orcs with, like, they've got body armor. I'm like, Spelljammer. I was like, what is that?
Do you know what it actually is, though? It is actually a Trapper Keeper in D&D. It's like, it was their version of, like Lisa Frank. And you know the Trapper Keepers that had, like, a liquid sky breaking into, like, a panther's face, like, airbrushed? That's what it was. It's like, oh, cool, you got your Spelljammer? Yeah, I totally do. And they open it up, and their scrolls are like...
yeah. And so that's the thing. And then I looked up Spelljammer, and I learned, as far as I remember, because I read it one time on Wikipedia, it's a thing in the world. A Spelljammer is a thing that's in the world, but it's like a thing that flies between planets. It's this really big, like... So in the same respect, Dragongrin...
Well, and Spelljammer is basically a D&D in space. Yeah. And they use airship-style things, and these magicians, like, not magicians, these party magicians come through, and they pull quarters out of ears of the actual arcane specialists that fly the ships.
But that's the thing, is in that respect, I'm like, that's really cool. And that name is a little funny, but once you know what it is, you're like, oh, actually, Spelljammer is really cool. In that same respect...
And I've learned to love the name. Well, I love that it's like Spelljammer.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Like, after learning about it, I thought, wow, I really want to, like, I would love to play it. That is such a cool idea. Now, in the same respect, I feel like, to some degree, that could be Dragongrin. Dragongrin could have nothing to do with anything ever, and it wouldn't matter.
You're right.
Because it's called Dragongrin.
No, you're totally right.
It's like, I'm trying to think of the name of, like, a game. That's the same respect. We're like, no, it doesn't doesn't actually have anything to do with it. It's just that's what it is. That's what they decided to call it.
Well, this isn't the name of a game, but something that always pops into my head when I'm thinking of names, and I think, well, two things particularly that are very, very popular in this era that we live in. If I came to you and I said, James, I'm going to make a portable music playing device, and this portable music playing device is going to revolutionize the world. I want to call it an iPod.
Yeah.
You'd go, a what? No. You got to work music into the name. You got to call it like, a Walkman. Even Walkman. A Walkman? I get the gist. The point is, what about one of the most revolutionary music streaming services, Spotify?
And I don't know where that name comes from.
I don't know.
But you know where a lot of names come from nowadays? The domain was available. It's not even a joke. Flickr is like, oh, Flickr, like camera. Well, we got to take the E out because somebody bought the regular domain Flickr with an ER probably in 1990, like...
Well, dude, and that's, and you always want to, sometimes too, there are these buzzwords that float around, like they're like, oh yeah, just balloony it. And you're like, what's balloony? They're like, oh, you share it on your Technorati dig. And you're like, what? Yeah, I'll balloony that photo.
Exactly, and so...
And it's spelled like BLLNI upside down.
I imagine there's like a G. It's more like a baloney than anything. It's like, I'm baloneying it. And they're like, no, it's actually, you say a baloney. And a baloney actually means valley.
The point to all of it is that sometimes the content, the soul of a thing, gives the personality to the name. Because I don't think when I'm opening Spotify, what's a Spotify? I just know that when my fat thumb hits that green dot, buddy, I'm stoked.
Yeah, it's just like Dragongrin. I want to play in Dragongrin. I want somebody to say that, and maybe one day somebody was like, I wonder where that name comes from. And they'll listen to this episode, and they'll be regaled with the tales of the iPod and the balloony.
And the balloony. They're going to be so sad. They'll be like, I thought there was a master plan.
But
I trusted these guys.
And in that same respect, and I think this is what you may be about to get to, is it may still eventually become something.
Yeah,
maybe I think one day it'll be like, oh, and that's why the whole time we always knew it was called Dragongrin.
Yeah, I will admit that it just came to me a week or two ago, and I thought, oh man, I hope everyone else is excited about this as I am. So it could be one of those things that totally just flops. And I'm like, no?
Kind of like Balloony. The Balloony launch was just really...
They were in the second .com bubble that was just Balloony. They spent $250 billion. I don't know on what. Maybe that launch party. No. So it's one of those things where I have the idea. I want to share it with you. I want to tell you what I think it means. And so I don't know how to do it other than just kind of say it. So I don't want it to be dramatic and be like, okay, are you... Oh, excuse me. I burped because we're drinking energy drink. So...
Yeah, you've succeeded at not making it dramatic.
Yeah, man.
By burping in your fake drama.
So what is a word that's worse than anticlimactic? This was reverse climactic. I went backwards.
Yeah.
So, to me, I thought, in our land, what if, a charnel house or a cemetery or basically a place where people are laid to rest, a mausoleum, a tomb, just the etymology is essentially it's called a grin.
Yeah.
And I love the idea that in this history of this world and in the history of the entire realm, which, like I said, the three continents are kind of connected together in a way, there's a history that has happened where it includes the gods and the dragons, and it's all a fairy tale at this point. But at some point, I would love it if there was this huge stretch of continent, and it's literally the Dragongrin. It's the resting place of scads of dragons. Yeah. Just like in one of the final battles, this is basically where it all happened, or maybe this is where they had to bury them or whatever. Yeah. But I would love if a piece of the continent was just this crazy, just twisted, demented place because it's essentially this shallow grave for at least more than 2, maybe 3, maybe 10 dragons.
Exactly.
And it's Dragongrin because it's like, this is the dragon graveyard. This continent, this world is known as when the gods and when the Titans, when they were all fighting, and when the Abzu and the Typhons and the dragons, all this stuff, somehow all the bodies of the dragons ended up here.
Yeah, either this is where they dumped them, this is where the battle happened,
Maybe a little of both.
Exactly.
Column A, column B. Something.
Yeah.
But I love that. I love that it's Dragongrin because it's like, oh, what's Dragongrin? Oh, it's the dragon graveyard.
Exactly.
And I just thought, you want to talk about some super dungeons?
Yeah.
Like, the bones of the dragons just absorb into, like, think about the elementals that would create. Think, like, oh man, I want to go inside a petrified dragon.
Yeah.
Or just even one that's, like, stayed somehow just alive enough to where you're just totally inside this giant dragon. I don't know.
Yeah.
But what are your thoughts on that?
I think it's really awesome. I think my favorite part is sort of like you said, but the main thing is keeping it very vague. This is the dragon graveyard, and it's because dragons died or were buried here. I could even imagine, like, this is literally where they buried them. When the Titans and everybody else inhabited the world, everything is a lot smaller and different, and maybe the continents were even in a different place, and that's just where they buried them. Or
yeah,
I could imagine it, being one big dragon. That's like, no, like literally, it's so big, like he rises and destroys the whole continent.
I love it. That's what I'm
saying.
saying.
Crazy stuff where it's like, oh, that's why they call it Dragongrin. Like eventually in the future, it'll be like, oh, okay, no, this is the official, this is why. But for now, people call it Dragongrin because for some reason, whatever it was, this is known, way back as the Dragon Graveyard.
I love it.
For whatever reason that is.
And I just, and just for anyone listening too, as we're building this world, notice how we just put a bunch of what ifs out there.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean we're going to stop we're going to start running games in this because we don't have to know. It's this long ancient history. Don't catch world builder's disease to where you're a monk scribing out every little detail of your world before your players even step foot in it.
Exactly, like trying to plot the timeline of this king and that king and, lineages, and that all matters when a player interacts with it. Or, it depends on what your goals are, but if you plan on running games, there are specific things you need to focus on and some things that you can leave a lot more open. A good example of that is I'm currently running a game in the world, and I don't know where on the map it takes place. I have a rough idea. I don't know where a lot of things are, but the important thing is I don't know who the king was, who the king is,
right,
where they live, but none of that matters because the players have no reason to worry about that.
They aren't interacting with it. And here's a perfect example in real life. Anyone listening, tell me the year that that World War II started and the year that it ended. One of the most powerful history-shaping events of our time. And you probably are shaky on the details.
Yeah, and I was even, like, for me, I was having a hard time recalling who the last few presidents were, because a lot of the early ones and a lot of the big names, but I wasn't, even old enough to really know what a presidential election was until a few years ago. Well, I say a few, I'm older now. Until, like, 2 years ago. No, but seriously, okay, so take 8 years ago,
right,
before the last, or rather 16 at this point. Because of the, the terms, it's like, that was a long time ago. I was having trouble remembering who it was, even what party they were affiliated with, because I was a child, I'm like,
and it
was so in the periphery, and I just didn't think about it.
Exactly. And so don't feel like you have to put too sharp of a focus on these things. And notice we're spitballing. We're just like, okay, yeah, I love that it's called Dragongrin. I love that it has something to do with whether it's actual or fictional. I really want it to be actual. But notice, we didn't say whether it's one big dragon. We didn't say whether it was a bunch of little ones. I love the idea that it's probably, like I said, a little of all of that.
Yeah.
The other thing that brings up, I love the idea that there's a whole region called Grin. It's like, and I don't know when that happened. I don't know if it was when the Dark Lord won that everyone just calls it Grin.
Exactly.
Like, it's like, yeah, that's the graveyard now. That's it. That's, like, I don't know if that's a colloquial name. Like, it's...
Yeah. Well, and exactly, and if you think about it, in some cases, like even, in our world currently, there are places that, countries that had a name, and the name changed. And I don't personally know why that name changed. I'm like, okay, well, this happened, and now Constantinople.
Istanbul, Constantinople. Well, like the USSR turns to Russia. Like,
it's like all of that where I'm like, no, I mean, I could look it up, and I was probably taught it at some point, but it's certainly not top of mind, like, oh, well, back in 1872, this happened, and that's why. And in that same respect, it's like, you know, the people in your world, if your player character goes up and asks the innkeeper, why is it called Grin? He might say, well, that's what I grew up calling it. Because that's what, you know, that's what happens. That's how it works.
And again, we're not figuring out right now today, did it used to be called like Essenza or like Luxa or something to where, and then evil wins and they're like, oh yeah, Grin. They're just calling it Grin.
Yeah, like, oh, everybody calls it the graveyard. That's our name for grave. It's just, no, this whole place says that's what it is. You know?
Yeah. And there are some other little things like, it's fun too, sometimes just go off on these little tangents. Like, I also thought it would be cool if there was a disease. And I think we talked about this, where like basically it's like sort of like the Joker's neural toxin, where in some form or fashion these people get these twisted visages, and it almost looks like these terrible smiles.
Yeah,
and you know, calling it like the dragon's grin, like, oh, they got the dragon's grin. Like,
and in that same respect, the reason something could be called something could be so many, you know, different things. In the same way that, you know, think of like sort of a folk tale or something,
sure,
that you've heard a lot of different
etymologies,
like origins.
Yeah.
There are so many different, like, no, you know, this means that, and somebody else might even think fervently that, no, you're completely wrong.
No, I
really
heard it was this. I heard it was this, and it's like a lot of it's a rumor, like where the middle finger came from.
Yeah.
Like, oh no, it was the bow finger of the archers for the da-da-da. And it's like,
it's the kind
awesome
of thing where,
story.
Yeah. In that same respect, it's like, no, the name Dragongrin could come from 10 different things.
Exactly.
And there's nothing wrong, you know, it doesn't have to be one thing, especially because in real life, there are so many different histories of so many different things that are half remembered by people when they're drinking. It's like,
and they are the cause for so many fights.
And basically, you know, not everybody in your world knows everything about your world, so there's no reason for you to, you know?
Right, as crazy as that sounds. And it's okay, I think, as we're sitting here now saying, yeah, some of that stuff's great, we'll figure it out when we need to.
Exactly.
We'll come up with it if we need to, if and how. Like, so that's Dragongrin. That's why, for now, that's why Dragongrin. That's why Grin. And, yeah, we'll see how that plays out. And how does this inspire you? You know, if you want to send us an email at tabletopterrors@gmail.com. What do you think of this episode? How are you naming things in your campaign world? What are you naming your campaign world, and why?
Exactly.
So, anything else you want to wrap up with?
No, I think that really about nails it. That's the most important part, is sort of going back to the beginning. Don't be self-conscious about what you name stuff. Don't worry if it's the same name as something else. You know, if you think something is cool, you know, something being called something that doesn't mean it's taken forever. Now, take Batman, for example. You're going to have a hard time naming somebody Batman because there's Batman, you know.
You hear scribbles.
But like one time when I was young, I made a paladin, I made a paladin. His name was Alistair. I thought that was a cool name. And then I realized that was the name of the sword in Devil May Cry that I hadn't played in a while, but that name stuck in my head, and I felt like, oh, I can't name him that. That's the name of the sword in Devil May Cry. Like, it doesn't matter. It's Alistair. You know, his name's Alistair. I love that name. It's really cool. Right. Nobody cares. You know, it's like I said, as long as you don't go with Batman. I'm like, well, no, in general, you're going to be in a pretty good place, and you don't need to feel self-conscious about why something's called Arthenvale.
Especially, and I think the caveat is that, especially if you don't do it on purpose.
Exactly.
Don't go ripping people off. That's not what we're saying. Don't like flip through a book and go, yep,
I want to name that.
Well, you can. Just don't be mad when people say, oh, that's the same thing as blank.
Exactly.
Like, the point of this hobby is that it's very open-ended. And people sell source books, so you can do that on purpose. But I could probably do a whole podcast on the things I've accidentally named, thinking that I had come up with them originally.
Exactly.
So, yeah, that's actually a really good point, too. So what's your Dragongrin? You know, just figure that out. And I guess if you're going to kind of do this along with us, I guess they can kind of follow our crazy cockamamie steps.
Well, maybe.
Yeah, we'll see. What's funny, too, is I think this episode's going on like 30 minutes. I was like, oh, this is going to be like 10 minutes.
10 minutes,
tops.
Real quick.
Tops. Yeah. So, this has been Damage Reduction, our world-building podcast. You can see more of this kind of stuff on tabletopterrors.com. And as always, may your dice roll high.
Singing, reduce the damage done to me.